After that inspiration, ladies and gentlemen, and we've been talking about ecosystems again, ecosystems of companies, we want now to try to pull all this together, to identify some key priorities, some key actions for the future. So our focus in our last panel discussion is on boosting growth through innovation. And let me introduce our panelists for this final session. And please do come and join me as I introduce you. Simon Hamilton, Minister for Health in Northern Ireland. Very warm welcome to you, Simon. Gaël Hotelier, who is an Executive Vice President at Siemens. Welcome to you, Gaël. Dorte Hoppner, Chief Executive of the European Private Equity and Venture Capital Association. Dr. Jan Erik Sundgren, Senior Vice President of the Volvo Group, and Professor Delphine Monceau, who is European Director of the Corporate Division at ESCP, the École Supérieure de Commerce de Paris, and a renowned author on companies' innovation capacity. A very warm welcome to all of you. We started this morning with Vice President Jyrki Katainen saying research and innovation are undisputed drivers for growth and jobs. Number one, I presume, panel, you would agree with that. We've had that sentiment from many, many people. But if they are to play that role of drivers of growth and jobs most effectively, what do we need to do? How important is this issue? And what do we need to do to create this ecosystem that we've been talking about? Minister Hamilton first.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Can I just begin by saying that it's an honour to be able to be here today and to participate in the conference. Can I thank, in his absence, the Commissioner for the invitation and congratulate him on organising such a successful conference. I agree entirely with the sentiment that innovation is a driver for growth and jobs. It's not something that is desirable or a sort of a luxury. It is absolutely essential if we are to grapple with the range of challenges that we face moving forward. And we're all well aware, I think, of those challenges that we face. We've got increased competition from around the world. We're also facing challenges in respect of public expenditure. And in my previous role in the Northern Ireland Executive, I was the Minister of Finance, so I'm well aware of what the challenges are in terms of diminishing public expenditure. And I think it's incredibly important that if you're, if you want to have an innovative economy, you have to have an innovative public sector as well. And I think that's an incredibly important aspect of, particularly for small regions like my own in Northern Ireland, where it is a small region, it's on the periphery of Europe. If we are going to encourage development of the economy and to see an innovative economy grow, the government cannot, and the public sector cannot be a sort of a silent actor, and we don't have the luxury that perhaps other bigger economies within Europe have. The government has to play a participative role, not directing where the economy goes, but being a facilitator for growth, a facilitator for the development of jobs and the economy. And that's somewhere where, particularly as I say, in a region like mine, where we are actually so dependent and traditionally have been so dependent upon the public sector for jobs and for growth within the economy. If we are to change that, as we want to change it across Europe, we need to have an innovative public sector, because if you have an innovative public sector, in my experience, you also have an innovative economy.
Thank you very much. Interesting, that correlation between the two things. I hope we can come back to that in the discussion, and perhaps also later, Simon, drawing on what Eric von Hippel was just talking about how you, as providing public services, work with citizens themselves to develop new innovations as well. But let's get an industry perspective now. Gaël Hotelier, if I could just ask you from an industry perspective, the key drivers for innovation, and how do we make sure we deliver them?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Well, we've heard a lot the last 1.5 days on what are the key drivers. Of course, innovation is for large, small and medium groups a key for survival, especially in Europe. If you are lacking on innovation, you're only being on competition on the same level with the others. And what remains is only productivity. So it's cost, and cost down. And Europe is not the cheapest place in this world. So it's going to be a tough run if you are not always innovating. And how do you innovate? Is very clearly, first of all, you need to have access to qualified people who can innovate. The second is you need to be able to have access to also the progress, the results of research, university, development institution. So we need to have this exchange altogether, industries and research and development. A third thing is, of course, and we see that, I mean, I'm the head of the hydrogen solution, which is quite a new technology within the Siemens Group. So trying to bring breakthrough technologies from the R&D laboratories down to commercialization, one of the key problems we're facing or challenges is legislation framework.
Okay, we'll come back to what elements of that legislative framework later on, but if I could just get another industry perspective, I'll come back to you in a minute, Dot. I just want to bring in the other side from Jan Erik Sundgren, as I mentioned, from Volvo Group. For you, the key drivers, and we talk, as Gail was just saying, everybody has agreed, innovation, 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 it's terribly important, but it's easy to talk it. How do we make sure that, particularly in policy terms, we walk it as well? How do we integrate it properly into our policy-making system? Are we doing that now?
Thank you very much, Jackie. It's a large and very large question, but I'll try to be rather brief. I would like to echo the fact that innovation is a key driver for growth. I mean, otherwise the business community in Europe would not stand for 2/3 of all the resources being invested in Europe. So obviously that's a key driver. But there are much things that needs to be done, and the business community in the sense of Business Europe, European Roundtable of Industrialists, as well as the European Risk Forum, yesterday sent a paper to the President of the Commission and to the Commissioner Moedas about how to change basically the culture and get a more innovation-friendly culture in Europe, and put forward some really concrete measures how to implement an innovation principle to be used to complement the precautionary principle. But basically that is a suggestion from the business community how to sort of evolve towards changing the culture, because I think the culture needs to be changed. It has been said again and again that Europe has a huge number of good researchers. We have good students, education has been brought up as a key role, but we are really looking forward to make a larger impact. That was said in the morning session, and I would like to echo that. And then the culture is important, and the business community have just given some concrete measures how to change that.
So you would begin to sort of road test every proposal, every piece of legislation about does it do good or harm for innovation? That's at the fundament of it.
Well, there are many aspects of that, but that's one aspect of that both in existing legislation and new legislation, one should at least consider the consequences of what innovation what kind of role it would have in innovation. And it's a question of sort of getting also the risk averseness to become.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to come back to that in the discussion. Dorte Höppner, yesterday the Commissioner in his opening address talked about one of the things, many things he talked about was changing the financing paradigm as very much part of this equation. How do you see the role of innovation and the financing paradigm within that? We have talked a lot over the last 2 days about venture capital, about the differences between us and the US in this area particularly. How important as a driver do you think this is? And are we on the right track to address it now?
Yeah, right.
You press the little button there. There we are.
Thank you. Innovation is only part of the story. You need to also bring the innovation to market, and you need to execute well the businesses. And so access to finance is clearly important for those companies that want to be innovative. And I think that is also important to keep in mind, that it's not only the young businesses that are innovative and are inventive, bring new products to market, but also those established companies. And I think here, actually, Europe doesn't need to be shy in comparing itself with Asia and with the US, because I think Europe is famous for its very innovative mid-market. And I'm not talking only SMEs here, I'm talking above SMEs, the squeezed middle that is sometimes forgotten. And here I think we also need to be proud of what we have and see what we can do to enhance them, to help them, support them, to fund innovation. Because every survey, every business survey, what is the biggest obstacle for you doing business, what is the biggest obstacle to growth, it's always access to finance, or rather the lack of financing. And this is, I think, where, that, of course, is a structural issue, because European businesses are used to be funded by banks. And since the financial market crisis, it became very clear that bank financing, is not sufficient, and the banks cannot fulfill this role right now in funding innovation and funding businesses in general. And so I think, we need to think about this. Is why also another initiative by the European Commission, the initiative of the Capital Markets Union, makes a ton of sense. It's about creating capital markets, so to give innovative companies, no matter what age, no matter what size, better access to also funding from capital markets, and so that banks going forward can focus on the SME financing, so those little companies that don't have access, for them it's impossible to get access to capital markets. And the good news is that there is enough private investment capital available in Europe. That's also something to keep in mind. It's not all bad here in Europe. We do have insurance companies, we do have pension funds, we do have, family offices, endowments, and they're all looking for yields. They all need to generate returns for the pensioners, for the savers, and they are interested also in investing in these risk asset classes. So in asset classes that fund risky ventures, funding innovation, and it's bringing the demand and the supply side for long-term investment innovation capital together. And I think this is the challenge that we are facing here in Europe. But again, I think it's very important to say it's not all negative. We also have to look at the strength of what we have here in Europe.
Okay, thank you. And that does beg that question, as you say, it's how do you bring them together? And why do we now have this situation where there is money,
yes,
and there are people who need the money, but somehow that marriage is not working? I'd also like to come back on the question of the link between private funding and public funding and how we use both sides. But thank you very much for that. Delphine Monceau, you are, as I mentioned, a renowned expert on companies' innovation capacity. What do you see as the key drivers and this link between their research capacity? I mean, it's fascinating what we were just hearing about citizen innovation and that staggering figure about, I think it was 3 times saving on the size of the development budget. How do you see the drivers and what are the implications of all of this?
Well, first, I think there is a kind of European paradox about innovation, because when you look at the rankings of the most innovative companies in the world, for instance, the Boston Consulting Group publishes such a ranking every year, and in the top 10, there is no European company, 0. 7 are American, 3 are from Asia, from Japan or Korea. But on the other hand, if you look at the innovativeness of countries, there is another index that is published yearly, the Global Innovation Index, about what countries are the most favorable to innovation. And in the top 5, you have 5 European countries, if you consider that Switzerland is in Europe, which is okay. And in the top 10, you have 7 European countries. The United States are just number 6. So I think it's a real paradox. It means that the European environment is good for innovation as a whole, and I completely agree with which was what just said on some real strengths that we have in Europe, but it doesn't transfer, at least into the largest, well-known innovative companies. So if you want to analyze why that happens, why is there such a gap, and it comes back to your question, I think that first we have many innovative companies, but not the largest ones. I think we have trouble helping companies grow and get bigger and bigger. And I completely agree with which was said before, that many very innovative companies are not startups. They are existing large companies, and we have also to make them become bigger and even more innovative. Another reason might be that we underestimate non-technological innovation. and maybe even the non-technological parts of technological innovation. That's about getting to the market, that's about marketing, sales, and so on. And then maybe a third reason is that when you look at these top 10 innovative companies, of course, many of them are web companies that were created 20 years ago, and so maybe the environment was not so favorable then in Europe. And so the good news is that since it's changing, maybe in 20 years we'll have more European companies among the top ones.
Yeah, that's a fascinating statistic. I wonder if anyone else wants to comment on that and why they think this is happening. Is it because we're not innovative in a broader sense? I mean, the point that was made earlier about the mobile phone, it's not just the technology, it's what are you going to use it for? And that's where maybe we're not as creative. How do we explain this? Top five of the top 10 countries for innovative environments, and none of the top 10 companies. Any other? Simon, please. And then Jan Erik.
Yeah, actually, I think it comes down in some measure to a point that Jan Erik made himself about culture. And I know that from experience back home, we have a fantastic.
Sometimes it does that.
Okay.
Sorry.
Some not very innovative technology.
No.
We have a fantastic industrial heritage. You know, it goes back over 100 years. Even in more recent times, sort of iconic developments like the new red London bus. 1 in 3 of those that go around the streets of London are made in Northern Ireland. 1 in 3 of business class aircraft seats are made in Northern Ireland. There's a little small region punching well above its weight, as we have done down through the years. But there is a cultural issue around growing beyond what might be described as a sort of a comfortable size. And perhaps that gets back to Delphine's point about not having large innovative companies. And obviously there are notable exceptions, and Volvo is one of those. But there are many examples, I think, right across Europe of where people grow their company and they take a risk and they get it to a particular size, and then you just get comfortable at the size that they are at, and perhaps sell that company or just keep it ticking over at the size that it's at without wanting to grow from. And I think that's what we want to see a lot more of, companies moving from £1 million of turnover to 10 million to 100 million, and growing and growing and growing and becoming those sort of big innovative companies that Delphine was talking about that can dominate the international market. So
traditionally we talk about not growing enough innovative startups. Perhaps we sometimes focus too much on that.
I think it is almost that point, and absolutely you have got to have startups, you've got to have innovative startups, you've got to have an environment which encourages people with ideas to get into business and to grow those business. But I think sometimes we're a little bit too fascinated with the idea of just having more startups, judging our success on the number of startups that are putting through. I think a better measure is almost how many of those startups, how many of those small, medium-sized enterprises that dominate the European economy move from being small to medium, or move from being medium to large companies.
Okay, thank you. Jan Erik, you wanted to come in here.
Yeah. Okay, I have three comments. First of all, it's the culture, as I mentioned initially. You need to be able to fail if you are going to get something growing, and I think we need to be more willing to take risks in Europe. That, I think, is quite clear. Then the access to capital, particularly for growth phases that takes long time before you reach a positive cash flow, I think is also a bottleneck. If I take one innovative company that comes from my own country, Spotify, they are for sure Swedish. The founders were Swedish, they have the headquarters in Sweden, but if you look at who are the owners of Spotify, it's for sure not Europeans. They've been forced to go to US and to the Middle East to get the capital, and they are still in a phase where they haven't reached positive cash flow. Thirdly, there are some sectors in Europe, so everything is not gloomy. There are actually a number of sectors, in the industrial sectors, that have really taken advantage of the fact that we've had the European Union programs, that we've had programs nationally, where we have really taken advantage of bringing together university research with industry research. I come from one sector myself. Volvo not longer making cars, but commercial vehicles, that is trucks and buses. And out of the 6, 7 largest global companies in this area, 4 or 5, depending on how you count, are European. So I think there are some sectors where we have done relatively well, or very good in fact, and there one has utilized the assets that are available in Europe. So I think we have both pros and cons, and I think Siemens is another company that has flourished quite dramatically over the last decades, also utilizing the research available in Europe.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to comment, but maybe to take it a little bit one step below, because not to stay at a high level. The interesting thing of those rankings is always how the first step I'm asking always myself is also one of the topics we had the last 1.5 days. How do you define innovation? Yeah. So if, of course, you're measuring basically totally new application, totally new breakthrough innovation, you do not have so many. What you do have is a lot of iterative improvement and innovation for the existing products, systems, solutions, services for your existing customer, your install base, and also what all companies have, depending on the size. It's not a question of large or small one. Regarding the risk adversity, I mean, let's take a look really concretely. You're talking about smaller company and startups moving to the US just for capital and venture capital reason. I don't share this opinion. It's not just a question of money. If you are an entrepreneur and you want to establish a company, take a look at the risk. If you're doing a company in Europe and you're failing, you're filing bankruptcy, you have a problem for the rest of your life. You do that in the US, you fail, you get the chance to start it again. So if I'm an entrepreneur and I have to make a choice, and I have to save my home and my family from a potential bankruptcy because there is always a risk for a new technology, I'll think about it twice to do it in Europe. That will be very concretely. Another thing is regarding the time frame. Smaller companies have a different cost position and also a different cost structure compared to mid-size and also larger companies. So they have a certain amount of time where they have, of course, to fight for financing externally, and they have a business case, but they have a limited risk in regard to the amount of money they're investing. Not always. Let's try to keep it simple. There's always a case where it's not the case. Now, when you are in large groups, all activities within the large groups are fighting for the same resources. The company, most of the company have a certain amount of statistically measuring the R&D amount they are putting within a financial year in R&D activities. After that, it's an internal split. So you have always, very concretely, my unit on hydrogen solution has to convince it is a worth it investment for the future of the company of Siemens, the same way than just iterative innovation on locomotive or automated machinery for production. This is reality of business. And of course, if you're doing this investment in a framework like Europe, where the legal framework doesn't cope with the speed of innovation, so it delays the time when you're going to hit a positive business case on a return on investment, larger company will tend to lose faster patience.
Okay, thank you. And that goes back to the point the Commissioner made yesterday about how do we make regulation that can adapt, that can move with the times. Dota, please do react to this discussion, but I also want to bring up with you this point about, and it's been made before, that at the seed capital stage, as you said, there's quite a lot of money around, and we just need to marry up the people who need it with the people who've got it. But it's the expansion phase. Now, it's part of Simon's comfort zone where some companies stay because actually the effort of getting the financing to grow to that next size, to upscale, is that part of the barrier? Would you agree that there is the problem is perhaps not just focusing, maybe we focus too much on the innovative startups, and Delphine, I'd like your thoughts on that it's that next phase that is causing the problem.
I mean, clearly, if you look at the numbers, seed capital, we have enough seed capital in Europe. There's so many initiatives, a lot of mainly public funding also, on a regional level, on a national level, on the EU level. So seed financing, I think that the market is well covered. But indeed, all those little companies who get the backing of public funding at a very, very early stage, at the seed stage, they're struggling to find venture capital as the next stage. And so we don't have enough venture capital in Europe. It's just one country, for example, Germany, has about an annual investment amount of 500 million euros for venture capital investments. I mean, 500 million, in the grand scheme of things, for Germany, biggest economy in Europe, this is tiny. In total, we have about 3.7 billion in Europe every year. So clearly, so the demand is much higher. And this is why there's a lot of public money also going into this area, into venture capital. The EIF is probably the largest investor in Europe, which is important. They do play an important role. But if it comes to public funding, it's also important to keep in mind, and I think this is, what can policymakers do, what can the EU do? We have this tendency in Europe that everybody should be treated equally, and everybody should get their fair share, and so we have the tendency to allocate everything equally spread about for all the companies and all countries. And I think we have to be a bit more competitive in our mindset, in the sense that only the best should really get the biggest funding. And those who are not the best, they shouldn't get any public funding, maybe. And I think that is a very non-European idea, more, I must say, than the thing about failure and risk averse, because that also has its merits. If you run a business, you need to have a certain risk averseness in order to make the company really grow. Anyhow, so I think public funding, that is also a fascinating topic where we could speak for hours. But even more important is to attract private investment capital. And again, this private investment capital is there, and it is also because of regulation, wrong regulation, or regulation rather that sets the wrong incentives, that this investment capital, private investment capital, is not flowing into asset classes like venture capital. To make it concrete, Solvency II, I'm sure you've heard of that big piece of insurance company regulation. Solvency II has risk weightings, really high risk, just as an example, where it hinders insurance companies to invest in the asset class venture capital. It makes it more expensive. And so this is one of the, just to give one concrete example, why regulation matters. Also, just to have a free flow of capital to where it's needed.
Okay, thank you very much. Delphine, a thought on this, and I'm coming out to all of you on this question of where the focus should be, in terms of do you see the fundamental problem, the creation of those innovative startups, as well as what you pointed to, which is we don't have the big guys? Where for you, have we perhaps over-focused on the creation of the innovative startups, or do we need a dual focus? It's right that we're focusing on it, but not to the exclusion of everything else.
I think that in many years we underestimated the importance of creating startups. But I think for the last 10 years a lot of progress has been done on this. And now one of the key issues is about growing. Growing for startups and growing for medium-sized companies. And the question of growth is at two levels. One level is getting some capital, and it was really well explained, so I'm not going to get back on that, but I think it's really the second, third stage of existence of companies that need a lot of funding and which has been underestimated in the past. And the second key aspect is access to large markets. I mean, in the US, you immediately have a startup or even any company innovating, or even a very old innovative company, has immediately access to a very large market. In Europe, despite all the efforts that have been made for the last 20 years, it's still very fragmented. Technical norms still vary from one country to the other. And usually for an innovation, after a few years, it's solved, but it's too long. It's too long for the company to be able to grow and have access to this.
Which takes us back to those gaps in the single market, but also to new emerging markets, and how do we get our first slice? Like, Jan Erik, you wanted to come in here.
Yeah. I think we need to keep focus on both small and medium-sized companies, startups and large companies. If you look in reality how much of the R&D currently being spent in Europe, and it's a majority coming from large companies, and also in terms of creating or sustaining jobs, perhaps not creating that many new ones. So the focus needs to be on all parts.
I'm also thinking about the relationship between big companies like yours and the startups.
I'm coming to that. Because in reality, we live in a symbiosis. The small companies, we rely upon having a good supply chain. That's why we run our own venture cap company, to really secure that we help this supply chain to develop, because that's crucial for us, and that we have a supply chain that is also existing in Europe. Some of them comes from universities, some of them comes from research at universities. A large fraction of them also comes from students at universities, so don't neglect the educational part. I think that is sometimes in conferences like this slightly neglected, but without skills and without the future skills, we won't be able to do
Well, I'm
this.
saying that's a point that has come up time and again. And new skills, different skills, the ones we wanted before. Delphine, you wanted a short one, if you would. Yep.
Yeah, very short. Just to say that education is absolutely key, because it leads to research and what was just said, but also because it's a key to changing mindsets, as was said before. I think one of the key barriers to the development of innovation in Europe is really about mindset, about accepting failure, about having a very large view of innovation, about being optimistic about the future, just this. And this is highly related to the educational system.
So we need entrepreneurship education, we need creativity education.
Absolutely, creativity, interdisciplinary education at all levels, and even at the PhD level, which is usually quite fragmented from one discipline to the other.
I want to come back shortly to this question of transferring the excellent science into commercialization. But Gail, do you want to say 2 words about how Siemens works with the smaller companies, this whole chain that Jan Erik was talking about? Because it seems to me we keep talking about ecosystems. There is an ecosystem within the private sector, and I'm wondering there whether that's something that just happens organically and you should be left alone, or whether there is any role that policymakers can play to help in that. Because we've been talking all the time about bringing different players and actors together. It's happening anyway. Should we just let it go on happening the way it is?
Well, Siemens is exactly as Volvo is mentioning, and like most large company, has an own Siemens Venture Capital unit. So we're looking at younger and startups investing as well for technologies close to our own portfolio or those enhancing our portfolio. I think the symbiosis is working quite well. We have a lot of cooperation with universities, and everything what has been said, I can only confirm. I think one of the topics that could help would be to simplify the application process under Horizon 2020, which is, for funding, which is still not an improvement compared to FP7. I'm sorry to say that. One very concrete example is the simple accounting procedures that we have to go through are so far away from reality of accounting procedures from companies that it's really, really complicated for companies, a large company at least, to apply for funding under the new framework. So that could be something, because in those frameworks we work together on specific projects. The second is, very clearly, on the framework point of view, I have a wish. I wish that the legislation world could find an innovative approach how to deal with legislation to cope with the speed of innovation. We are sometimes discussing text at European level on legislation for 5, 6, 7 years. It is a long procedure, it's a democratic procedure, a lot of voices that have to be heard, a lot of interests that have to be taken into account. At the end, we are all released that legislation is passed. So we have a certain certainty for investment and for our customer to potentially invest. But the problem in the process is, in the 6 years that have been negotiated, there have been at least one round of innovation that has been missed. So we could immediately restart. So
That tension
time
between the
frame, no,
flexibility and the certainty
frame.
is not working.
No, it's basically the rhythm
Yeah.
is a totally different. And this is a killer, because as long as new technology are not as quickly as possible, or state-of-the-art technology is not as quickly as possible included in the legislation, there is no investment possibility either for R&D
Okay.
or for customers to invest, because they don't know how to deal with it in the next 4 years.
Thank you. Dr. Quick one, and then
Well,
comes Simon.
completing the single market, that's also still very much on the to-do list. You don't always have to come up with new policy initiatives and come up with a new whatever investment vehicle. But this project of having a single market, this is the reason why everybody is going to the US. If you have an innovative company, if you want to bring your product, if you want to really bring it to the global stage, you have to go to the US, because it is the biggest market. It's the biggest single market, and we are not there yet. So that might sound completely boring, but it is, still something that we need to work on, and that includes also legislation, that
Okay.
we have a unified, harmonized set of
Thank
legislation
you.
and regulation.
Simon, a quick thought from you on this, but more broadly, you described yourself earlier. You said we cannot be a silent actor in this process. And I've been asking a bit about, where one sees the role for policymakers and all this. You described yourself as a facilitator in that sense. What do you mean? How do you think policymakers can really help? And where should you, as a government, butt out and just let them get on with it, if I can put it that way? Then I'll come out to all of you.
Yeah, I think I sort of grew up and in early years within government, heard a lot of business representatives making exactly that point, that we should should get out of the way of business. I've heard everybody from UK Prime Minister down to business leaders in Northern Ireland saying exactly the same thing. And I can understand and actually sometimes agree with the point. But particularly when you have small economies, small regional economies like ours, it's incredibly difficult to do that. And in fact, growing an economy, making an economy much more innovative, almost counterintuitively requires government involvement. And I don't mean it in the sort of traditional sense of providing education, developing skills through our universities and colleges, or making infrastructure investments, but also in around the whole financing piece. So I don't think anybody in government particularly wanted to become bankers over the last number of years. We were unpopular enough in politics without also becoming bankers as well. But we've had to step in, because exactly the point that was made before, that it isn't, there are issues now around supply, or a lack of supply, or a lack of demand. Sorry, we've switched from a lack of supply to a lack of demand. But it's that different funding mix that many banks, it's not just traditional bank finance. We've had to step in and do that. We've had to create different funding streams for infrastructure, particularly for growth boosting infrastructure investments as well. But there's also a role for particularly around developing policy, developing legal frameworks, developing regulations for government to work much better than it has in the past. In the past, I think there's been a tendency for government, and I suppose it goes right up to European Commission level as well sometimes, to just maybe do a bit of a consultation and then just pass down regulation or new legal frameworks. One innovation that we have done in Northern Ireland is create a public sector innovation laboratory.
Yes, yeah.
Which sounds a bit like, I always worry about talking about an innovation laboratory and the sort of the idea of people in white coats and safety goggles and Bunsen burners and things like that. But it's really just a safe space, a physical space, not an actual physical space. It can happen anywhere, where it is government working alongside business, working alongside academia, working alongside the third sector. And there's quite a few examples of this around Europe at the minute, and I think it's something quite exciting, something that we're in the vanguard in. But what that has been able to do is, and we've worked on areas that, including regulatory impact assessments, which maybe isn't the most exciting of areas, but does have an interface clearly with our business community, around innovation and procurement. And we're also working with the European Commission at the minute to perhaps use our lab to test a right to challenge, where regulatory reforms, where regulation in Europe perhaps is inhibiting innovation, that there is a possibility to challenge that regulation to take it away to see if innovation can happen. There's been many benefits in taking this approach, and it's gaining popularity in Northern Ireland, and many departments are using it as a vehicle. But it breaks down a lot of those barriers that are there between government has a view, business has a separate view, academia has a separate view as well. But by bringing all three actors and other actors together, you can see the problem and the possibilities from each other's point of view, and you can get round those sort of mindsets and sometimes prejudices
And
that build
that I
in.
think one of the very big common strands through the last day and a half in terms of one of the roles identified for policymakers is that convening process, that bringing together. And we talked a lot this morning about the role of the stakeholders. We had the signing ceremony for the next phase of European Research Area. How do you get that commitment from everybody to do their bit, so that it can't be done by one? So very much echoing a theme of the last 2 days. I want to come back on the question of why we are, the way the Commission put it, less successful than we should be, could be, in terms of translating excellent research, excellent science into commercialised products. Where is the problem there? How can we unlock that? You know, we often, in many areas, we are world leaders in the technology, but it doesn't tend to get developed in Europe. Why not? What do we do about that? But let's see if there are any questions or comments from the room first. Anybody have a question to our panel, or indeed a comment to what they have heard? Anything I should point out, this is the last half an hour of 2 days of very intense talks, I know. If you have a burning issue, ideally related to the topic of the panel, but I might even be a little bit more flexible. Something you're thinking, I've been here for a day and a half and nobody has mentioned X, and I cannot believe it, because if we're going to open up to an era of innovation, we really need to talk about this. Or are we covering the ground beautifully here? Well, I'm not sure whether I'm going to take that silence as that we're on the right track, but please, thank you. If you could, I know you've spoken before, but for this panel, introduce yourself again. Thank you.
I'm Tiziana Ferrari from EGI. I would like just to bring a topic that I raised in a previous discussion today in the morning, but I don't think this was picked up by the panel. So one of the problems that we experience, especially in provisioning of ICT services within the research community, is that there's a lot of expertise in advanced services for ICT applied to research that may have a potential for the private sector, but because of different regulations across Europe, it's very hard to essentially bring this innovation into the private sector, because many publicly funded organizations, especially those that have a mandate in doing research, cannot do that as a service.
Can I ask you a question back? Because when I put it to the panel this morning, the answer, guys, and what do you do about it? Because we had heard about fragmentation. You're talking about completing the single market being crucial. But what is your answer to that? Is it legislation? Is it rules that make us have a harmonised system? What do you think needs to be done? As you've raised it twice, and the panel this morning said, no, we're not going there.
It's legislation, I guess.
We do need harmonised legislation in this area to make it work.
So, for example, we have within EGI an initiative for developing a federated cloud for research, and we have, because there's the data which has a potential for business, and we have demand sporadically from SMEs, can we get access to the services, how could you support us? And we don't know, because we are European, and some organizations can provide services commercially. They actually want to do that to make their infrastructure for research more sustainable. In other countries like Germany, this is totally impossible. So whenever we do something, we have to negotiate and
find out.
So it's very hard to do it in a federated way across Europe.
Thank you. Before I come back to the panel on that, anybody else while I'm out here have a comment or question? Please, Peter.
May I?
You're very welcome.
Thank you very much. It's an absolutely fantastic discussion. Very difficult to disagree. The importance of the non-technological aspects of innovation, the business models, the marketing, the innovation principle, the availability or the lack of availability of venture capital. We have enough of startups, actually. We heard this also this morning, but why is the venture capital volume not sufficient? So very difficult to disagree. There's one thing which you identified as a problem, and that's regulation. And building on what Simon said about the laboratory in Northern Ireland, the Public Sector Innovation Laboratory. We tried to identify in the Research and Innovation Department regulatory bottlenecks for the optimal ecosystem for research and innovation in Europe. Very difficult to come up with really clear cases where the regulation is a problem. We would like to step in and fix it. So my question to the panel, you mentioned Solvency II or hydrogen. Could you give us some concrete examples, perhaps, which we could test then, how it would work if we allow a right to challenge these rules which are hindering innovation?
You have a right to challenge, don't you, in Northern Ireland?
Well, there's a UK right to challenge policy, which is slightly different. It allows, I think it's providers from the third sector and the charitable sector to challenge existing providers. This is slightly different. I understand completely the point that Peter makes, because I can recall a similar conversation and question that I put to a small business organisation in Northern Ireland many years ago, where the accusation was it's regulation, it's red tape, it's bureaucracy that's preventing us from growing. And I can remember, and I didn't ask the question in a confrontational way. It was a genuine question. I said, well, look, if you could produce a list for us, a bit of a compendium of all of the various pieces of red tape that was preventing your business, the business of your members from growing, from being innovative, that would be very useful for us. We could take that, see what we can take forward ourselves, take other bits to the UK government, or bring some perhaps to the EU. I'm still waiting on the list of regulations. And that doesn't mean, I'm not being flippant, it doesn't mean that there aren't issues that cause concern. And that's why I think the merit of a right to challenge isn't that at this minute in time we can't fill a page of areas where we would like to challenge that. It's to have that device there, I think, is a benefit. I think if we can have that there, ability to do that for people who from time to time might say, well, look, here is a problem. They bring that to the Commission. They say, yes, the Commission assesses it and says, yes, that is an appropriate place for a right to challenge. Let's proceed with that. I don't think it's something that's going to be used every day. I'm sure Peter hopes that it isn't something that's going to be used every day, but to have that ability there on the books, I think, is something that's quite important, and I would very much welcome and I look forward to Northern Ireland playing a role in developing any right to challenge mechanism.
Okay. Jan Erik wants to come in, and Gail wants to come in on this.
Peter, obviously there are a number of examples. I could give you one for right now from Sweden, where Sweden finally is trying to do public procurement for innovation, but we are stuck in the midst of that. This is to procure and use a new electrified transport system. But we're in the midst of that, are stuck with a number of concrete problems where Swedish legislation has probably gold-plated some legislation coming from the European Union and made it even more stringent. Also, I think we would be happy from the business side, for example, Business Europe, to provide you with a number of concrete examples of where this has really happened, and we can deliver those basically beginning of the fall. But equally important, I think, is to also bring up good examples. There must be good examples in Europe where you have innovation policies that is really working, and not only bring up the bad examples. I think we should also put forward some really good examples.
That's very striking, Jan Erik, because earlier I think it was Ian Cameron was saying, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. Some of us are doing some really good stuff in this area, and it's working. We just need to tell each other about it and see what we can replicate. Gail, you wanted to come in here, and then Delphine, I think you also, and I'm sure Dr. will.
Very simple, concrete case we are having right now is the integration of green hydrogen produced from renewable into the refinery processes, which would immediately lead to decarbonization of the refinery process and end up in the transportation sector. This is a typical example. The FQD legislation took 6.5 years, and as we addressed that last year, as the technology is now available faster than everyone thought it would, I have a full understanding of the people responsible within the Commission for the legislation. They say, I don't want to open it again. We do it once it's over, and then we take it a look. Maybe an ID. I do not know how to deal with it. But what would be helpful would be if we would find a way to have the legislation mentioning always only state-of-the-art technology. Now we need to identify a gremium that may be reviewed yearly with companies or research institution plus national representative plus commission to say what is for this year the state-of-the-art, because you are having an instrument always taking into account the most innovative state-of-the-art commercialized technology.
I wanted to ask you, in fact, how America, how some of our rivals, the people we compare ourselves with, and when we say we're not doing so well, how do they deal with this? Because, okay, our legislative process may be the slowest because of the nature of the EU, but other legislative processes, I mean, are not always that fantastically fast. How do they get right? Is it a question of the way you frame the legislation? Is that the answer here? Just a quick follow-up on that, Gail.
I don't know if any country have found the perfect way to do that, to deal with that, but it seems that certain countries are faster, or they frame it broader so that you are less focused on the technology list, but you say this is the framework where we are acting. Within this framework, the most efficient or the most green, or you define the framework. Let the technology and the market decide.
Okay, thank you. Delphine, please do react to this discussion, Dorte, but I want to also move on to this question of why we are not so good at translating. We've heard a lot about, you know, leadership in many areas, excellent science, fantastic research, but we're not quite delivering as well as we can. Do you, from your studies and your analysis, have an answer to why not?
Well, the first aspect, I think, and it also gets back to your question, is there any topic where we've been missing for the past day and a half? I don't think we've missed it, but there are a few topics that I would like to emphasize. The first one is that there are many drivers for innovation. There is science, there is technology, there is also usage, the way people actually use products, and there is business model. And I think in the past 10 years, and it's going to be even more in the next 20 years, new business models are a key driver for innovation. So it's not so much related to technology. If you look at the press industry, the transportation industry, I mean, with Uber, BlaBlaCar in Europe, and so on, the music industry, we were talking about Spotify, we have great European champions in that regard. In the energy industry, everything is changing as well. So I think when we think about innovations and way to drive innovation, we have to keep in mind that it's really a multifaceted, holistic concept, and it's not just about science and technology.
So which really echoes what Dr. von Hippel, with his illustration of citizen innovation, we're blind to it at the moment, we're not seeing it.
I think we see it, but we see different fractions of it, we don't put it together enough. That's maybe my first view. My second comment is related, it's about interdisciplinarity. The science is really structured by disciplines and fields, and this works, for instance, through academic publications. All journals are in specific fields, and there are very few interdisciplinary journals. And innovation these days, it's a lot more about interdisciplinarity. So this is something I think we really need to encourage. I think companies are much more interdisciplinary than academic research. I'm an academic, so it's not, so I'm very comfortable saying this, but I think in the public policy aspect, we need to find ways to stimulate more interdisciplinary research, interdisciplinary publication, events, and so on. And the last aspect, I will be short, I mean, is about mindset. We already talked about it. I think we need to be optimistic about our continent. I think talking about our success stories. We have amazing success stories, and we tend to sometimes look to the other continents, even though we have great champions. So I think we need to communicate more on the incredible innovations that succeed in Europe.
Thank you. Dorte, talking there about being innovative in business models and so on makes me think in terms of also innovative financing models, crowd funding being the most obvious and fairly dramatic development. I mean, we've seen some extraordinary developments there. Do you think we're being innovative enough in thinking through how to how to capitalize on all of this. As she said, the situation isn't as bad as we sometimes paint it. Where for you is the challenge? And if you have any thoughts on this question of the transfer from excellent science to market.
Right, yeah, and being innovative with, yes, of course, financing schemes, crowdfunding is very innovative, even though I must always say it's not exactly smart capital, unlike venture capital, where you also add the expertise and the network of the venture capitalists to the business. Crowdfunding comes as capital, but without the smart element. But also being innovative about public funding schemes, and I think that is maybe one of the biggest challenges, because Europe is spending so much on public funding and subsidies of innovation, R&D, also venture capital, as I said earlier, and they're thinking about new ways, and again, thinking about ways how to back only those companies that really have the highest potential to grow, and maybe also leaving the decision who those companies are to the private sector, leaving the decision of identifying the champions of tomorrow to the private sector, and not by, applying to some state agency that is then making the judgment call whether this company really has the potential to grow. And I think that just one example, we have come up with an idea of how to grow venture capital in Europe, how to fund them a bit differently by giving that mandate to identify the best venture capital firms that should receive the public funding, leave that to private sector fund-to-fund managers, so to the private sector, so they can make the judgment call, because ultimately they want to see returns, and so bringing them into the process. And I think that would be very revolutionary almost for how public funding policies are being dealt with here in Europe, and that might be a form of innovation in that context.
Gail.
Just a brief comment on Delphine regarding interdisciplinary. I think it is also one of the challenges regarding legislation. New business case also appears at the intersection between existing industries and businesses and application. Typical example, hydrogen, it addresses energy, transportation, and also any kind of industrial processes. Now, if you're trying to do a legislation discussion around that, who do you talk to in the Commission? Do I talk to DG Energy? DG Energy with DG Climate? How about industry? Because the path of use can be all. So this is exactly the same topic we have in large company, the silos. How do we manage disruptive new technologies with this vertical approach of legislation? Same way.
Thank you. Just one issue I want to touch on before we try and draw some conclusions and go back to what Eric and Pedro were talking about. And I'm thinking here, and I'd like to know, particularly, first of all, from our company people, co-creation. Do you currently use, never mind the citizen innovation that comes absolutely bottom up, but do you use your customers to drive your innovation? If you do, how? In public services, do you use citizens to find the innovations to improve public services? Is that working? Are we realizing all this potential that's out there? Jan Erik.
Yeah, of course, we use customers. We use customers, we use the supply chain, and in many cases also other stakeholders in society to get them involved in our research activities.
And how do you do it?
Well, first of all, when it comes to customers and the supply chain, we try to involve them, for example, in European Union programs, in the FP7s. We've been in the FP program since 1984, so we have a good track record of doing that.
And bring them into those structures,
Sure. Bring them into our projects.
Yeah.
Then when it comes to sort of utilizing students, which I think is an untapped resource at universities, we have a number of events where we have innovation competitions, where we really look at real problems with students and all over the world.
Okay. Gail, and then Simon, if you would.
Same things. Beyond that, what we additionally have within Siemens is we have an open network or internal clouds where we ask you can throw, if you have a technical question, you can just throw this subject on your internal platform. And because experts are everywhere in such large companies, especially technically driven, innovation-driven companies, so you mostly have a lot of ID from any one of your 390,000 colleagues.
Thank you. Simon, from a public sector perspective.
I don't think we do it enough, and you would think, given that our purpose within the public sector is to serve the public, you would think that we would listen a lot more to what our service users were saying. I think there are some processes are perhaps not sophisticated enough, they're not extensive enough. I think one of the challenges for the public sector is, how do you sift through, if you were to start to take the views of your service users on an ongoing basis, you could be inundated with responses, some small and not as impactful, some perhaps good ideas and ones that you would want to take forward. But
so how are you going to navigate through that?
How do you sort the wheat from the chaff? I think our laboratories is a good way, at least in targeting that sort of co-production and co-design with various stakeholders who themselves can draw on the experiences of citizens. We've tried to take on the views of our own staff, because one of the things I recognised in my previous post was that our staff is one of our best resources that we have within. Our civil servants and our public servants are a fantastic resource. They have ideas. They will be working at the coalface day in, day out, and they will see opportunities to bring about change. And one of the an early engagement I had as finance minister was one that was quite encouraging but also quite worrying. I was speaking to a group of about 30 various public servants, and I just made this point about, you're working every day, you're bound to see opportunities to change, to be innovative, and they all agreed yes that they did. And I just said, well, what are the barriers? I asked the group, what are the barriers to coming forward with these ideas? And because surely if you see something that would improve it, surely you would want to see that enacted. The First Lady, she put her hand up and she said that her problem was that her boss was about to retire. So he wasn't interested in doing anything new. The second one was funnier but more worrying. She said that if she brought her idea to her boss, he would probably steal it and pass it off as his own and get promoted as a result of it. So I realised that we needed to create different platforms to get around this. So we're using some online platforms within the government in Northern Ireland to try to get the ideas of our staff and get them to the people who can take decisions on it, and not sit and do nothing with them, or not steal them and you pass them off as their own.
You remind me of a very famous cartoon which appears on a card which I send to all my women friends, which is a group of mainly men sitting around a table, and the woman is speaking and the chair of the meeting is saying, "It's a jolly good idea, Miss Twigg. Now let's see if one of the men would like to suggest it." And because we've been talking about gender equality today and innovation, it came into my mind when you said that. Delphine, in your studies of what makes companies innovative, this element of co-creation, how important is it? And they're saying, Jan Erik saying we do it all the time, Gail saying we do it. Are companies doing it enough? And then we'll try and draw some conclusions.
I think companies have been doing it, but on a narrow basis for several decades. What has changed recently in the past 10 years is that it has become broader, with larger types of consumers, but also of research. I mean, it's really about open innovation all over the world, with working with people all over the world. And there has been some studies analyzing the impact, and they show that starting and developing open innovation is very complicated for a company, because there is this tradition that, what is invented inside is better than what comes from the outside. So it really requires a cultural shift within the company to avoid what we call the NIH, non-invented here syndrome. But when it works, then companies become more innovative. The new products and services that develop are even more innovative, and it's more radical innovation. They also tend to innovate much faster, but it's not cheaper. That should be said, because sometimes people think that open innovation is a good cost. A good response to cost issues, but it's not. It's really a leverage to innovate more, faster, better, but not in a cheaper way.
Okay, we are almost out of time, but as you've been here for the last day and a half, you know what I'm going to do now. I want to try. I've asked every panel, every set of speakers, what their priority is for the future. When it comes to boosting growth through innovation, to launching this new start for Europe that we've been talking about, what for each of you if you had a dream, what for each of you, and I'll start this time with Gail and just come along the line, what for you is the most, if you had to just pick one of the things we've talked about, a priority of priorities, in order to make sure that we do this, what for you would it be? You have 1 minute each. Gail, and I'll just come straight down the line.
For me, it will be definitely to identify a new approach on writing legislation that takes innovative speed better into account and creating the framework.
So it's that speed issue is absolutely central. Daughter.
Making a proper assessment of the capital markets, of the opportunities, how to finance innovation, how to finance businesses, and then drawing the right conclusion, revisiting existing regulation, and making some tweaks where it's needed, and being open-minded also to access new forms of financing and integrating that into into the economy and also a bit in the society, I would say.
Thank you very much. Simon.
I think there are a lot of little things in the short term around financing, around legal frameworks and regulation that we should be working on. But one of the, I suppose, if you're asking me to dream and think big about it, it's probably more around that whole culture piece. I think we've got to encourage, and Pedro's presentation shows us that we can all be innovative. You know, we don't have to leave this to people who are working in literal laboratories and in companies. We don't have to leave this to industry. Every single one of us has the potential to be innovative, and we can all be entrepreneurs as well. And I think there has been a real slide back in recent times from you know, in education, choosing education pathways that encourage people to get into business, to work in industry, for more sort of safer options around the law and accountancy and things like that. So I think that there is a need for that cultural change, where entrepreneurship, one where innovation is actually at the heart of what we do, and is not seen as something that is for a small group of people to do.
Thank you very much. Jan Erik.
Start to change the culture towards a more innovative culture, and by implementing the innovation principle. And the business community, through Business Europe, European Roundtable of Industrialists and European Risk Forum, yesterday submitted some suggestion on how to do that very explicitly. So we are ready for a dialogue, and I hope the Commission will take up this and start this dialogue. I think there is much to be gained, but we have presented how to do this, or at least our suggestions. So that would be my suggestion.
Thank you very much. Delphine, you have the last word.
Promote interdisciplinarity in research and education, and also the collaboration between the corporate and academic world.
And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, will you join me in thanking our panel very much indeed. Thank you so much to you all.